So right at the end of Samach Vav Hamid Beis, you'll see the wide lines on the bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up before the end of the Omud Ashkechan.
Got
And the
it.
Gemara had already given us a source in the cases of Pesach and Tamid that you bring them on Shabbos. So if Pesach Yudalid falls out on Shabbos, then you bring the Korban Pesach, and of course the Tamid falls out on Shabbos every week, and it overrides the Shabbos for many different malachas that are done during the course of that crop. But so far we've only brought a source that you can override the Shabbos. Ashkechan Tamid U Pesach the Dachu Shabbos. But we've already quoted sources. In the case of the Korban Tamid, the pasuk says Ola Shabbos b'Shabbato, and the pasuk has a Gzeret Shavah between the Korban Pesach and the Korban Tamid. So we know that these two korbanos override the Shabbos. But the Gemara says, Didachu Tumah Minola. We have a Gemara later on which establishes that Korbanos Tzibbur and the paradigmic cases of Korbanos Tzibbur Pesach and Tamid are brought even B'Tumah. So let's say most of the Tzibur is Tameh, or all the Kohanim that are available to do that Korbanos HaTamid or HaPesach or any Korban Tzibur HaTameh, or even in a case where the Kli Chares became Tameim. In all these cases, we know that a Korban Tzibur overrides Tumah, Minolan. But what's the source for that? Now, it's interesting that the Mefarshim here are bothered by the Gemara's question. The very premise that underlies this question, Minolan, would seem to be somewhat strange, because what we know is that there's a pasuk that says b'moado, and that pasuk is the source for both Tamid and Pesach, that they override the Shabbos. And the question is, why can't that same pasuk b'moado teach us that on any occasion, no matter what the circumstances are, since it's a time urgent korban, therefore b'moado tells me to bring the korban, which would mean even if there's tumah, should bring the korban. In other words, once you already have the concept derived from b'moado that the korban is absolutely critical, and therefore it overrides the Shabbos, and therefore when there's a collision and overlap between Shabbos and the korban, we bring the korban. So the same thing should apply even in the case of tumah, because the korban is absolutely critical and it's time urgent, time sensitive, as we say. So why wouldn't that alone, this word b'moado, which overrides the Shabbos, teach me that it overrides tumah? Now the Gemara earlier had quoted Hillel. Hillel did not have this drasha of b'moado. He didn't learn that all korbanos can be docha Shabbos from the word b'moado. And later on Daf Ayin Zayin, the Gemara is going to quote a brisa that derives from b'moado. So it means that Hillel disagrees with that brisa. So in effect, what we're left with, according to Hillel, is that we don't have a source for overriding tumah because we don't have the word b'moado. And Hillel doesn't darshan the word b'moado. But it's a little strange, a little bit odd that this Gemara, Minolan, is raising this question dafka according to Hillel, as if to say, leaving out Hillel, Einochinami, we would use the word b'moado to teach me not only that these Korbanos Tzibur override the Shabbos, but that in addition they override Tumah. But he has here a note in the Mesifta in the name of the Tzlach. Ein lilmod shedocheres hatumah mikal v'chomer shemein docheres haShabbos hachamura sha'ancha b'skila vaday kolchkein sheyidchu es hatumah shenase kal yoseh. He says, why not derive, not from the pasuk b'moado, and this question of the tzlach is difficult even according to Hillel, who doesn't have the drush of b'moado. Why not derive Tumah from Shabbos with a Kal V'chomer? Shabbos is more chomer; it's an Easter skila, and yet, if necessary, we'll override the Shabbos on behalf of the Korban. So too, we should override Tumah on behalf of the Korban. Tamei sheshimesh, if a Tamei would do the avoda, the worst, most severe punishment that he might incur is a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim, but certainly not misas bezdin. The af machmas bias migdash ha'onishu rak b'kares. And if you'll tell me, well, the Kohen not only did the avoda, but he also entered into the migdash, but that's also an onish kares, which puts it on a lower level than the chiyuv skila in the case of Shabbos. Says the tzlach, yesh lit lomar sheha oved b'tumah harei mechal es avoda. The severity of Tumah is that if you don't have a dechia, if you don't have a reason to override Tumah, then the avoda is completely invalid. Masha'en kena oved b'Shabbos, although he violated the Shabbos, ach avodaso kshera. So therefore, there's a certain chumrah within the specific context of kodshim of Tumah over Shabbos. So the Gemara answers, Amri, ki yehechi diyolif Pesach mitomid. We have a Gzeir Shava of Moado, b'Moado, that derives Pesach from Tamid. That just like Tamid overrides the Shabbat, so too Pesach. That's as far as Linyan Shabbos. So in this Hachinami Nelev, we should also derive Tamid mi Pesach, and we go in the opposite direction as well. Le'inyan Tumah. And Pesach Gufa Minolon. How do we know that Pesach overrides Tumah? Or Rabbi Yochanan, the Amakra, the pasuk says with regard to, in Parshas Ba'aloska, with regard to Pesach Sheni, Ish ki yeh tamei l'nefesh, and then the rest of the pasuk reads, O b'derech rechokah lachem, O l'dorosechem v'yasa Pesach Lashem, and the Torah tells us that if he's tamei, or alternatively he's b'derech rechokah, then b'chodesh hasheni b'arba'as hayom bein arbayim v'chodesh iyar, he will bring a Pesach Sheni. Therefore, since the Torah went out of its way to give you the extra word ish, it says ish, that redundant ish is to teach you that only an ish is nidchel lePesach Sheni, v'einat tzibor nidachim lePesach Sheni ele avdi v'tumah, that if the entire tzibur are in a state of tumah, then we don't push it off till Pesach Sheni. We'll bring the Korban Tumah on Pesach Rishon. And now we have a Gzeir Shava of b'Moado to learn Talmud from Pesach. And that's going to teach me that just like Pesach overrides Tumah in the case of a tzibur that was Tmeim, so too the Korban Talmud will override Tumah in the case of Rovat Tzibur Tmeim. So we have now a reciprocal derivation or equation. We're going to learn Shabbos from Talmud. We're going to learn Tumah from Pesach. Now, what happens in a case where a miut of the Tzibur are Tmeim? That's called Yechidim. And in the case of Yechidim, we know that the Torah tells us that Doche Nidchim lePesach Sheni. It's only when it's Rov HaTzibur. Now, this derivation from Pesach seems to be very difficult, very strange, because when we say that we override Tumah, we do so for the sake of a Korban Tamid, a Korban Tzibbur. And surely Tamid is a Korban Tzibbur, but Pesach is not a Korban Tzibbur. Pesach is a Chovas Yachid, and although we gather together as a Chabura, but that's not a Tzibbur. Chabura is not necessary. We don't need more than one person. He says that if you read Rashi carefully, Rashi seems to be addressing this later on in Masechet Pesachim. And Rashi says that if there are a lot of Tmeim, are they called Tzibbur? Alo yesh, we should consider Lachshivam Karbi Yechidim Shenichalim Gamkein Be'isha Nidche. In other words, even if you have a majority of the congregation of Israel that it's Tmeim, it's really just an arithmetic addition of Yechidim. It's a conglomerate of Yechidim. It's not a Tzibur. I mean, there's no Chovas Tzibur in Korban Pesach. And therefore, if it's just an addition of Yechidim, it just happens to be their Rov, then they should be included in the word Ish, and they should be bringing their Korban with Pesach Sheni. The Rashi says something which I can't understand, and he says that Pesach is called a Korban Tzibbur. Why? Because it's Ba B'Kinufya. It comes with masses of people together. And we gather them all together, we set them up into 3 groups, and we go into that was today's daf, and we go into the Azara, and that's called Kinufya. I fail to understand why Kinufya upgrades the Korban Pesach into a Korban Tzibbur. Now, on a philosophical level, the Maharal Prague takes a stab at this. And he wants to explain the difference between Rabbim and Yochid. He says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu becomes a Melech over the Rabbim. He is the God and the sovereign ruler over the masses, over the congregation. However, in the case of an individual, God is the sovereign ruler, but only if the Yochid accepts upon himself God as his ruler. So therefore, a Yochid will be postponed, will be delayed till Pesach Sheni, but not the Rabbin, because the Yochid has to prepare himself, and now he's Tomei, he needs all that time until Pesach Sheni to be ready so that he could be Makabel Elokus. But Rabbin, they don't need this hachana and this preparation of para, because even in a state of Tumah, Kodesh Baruch Hu is still their sovereign ruler, and they are his servants. Even though right now each individual is not Roy, he's Tameh, but nevertheless, as part of a greater entity of a Tzibur, Kodesh Baruch Hu is the Melech over the Tzibur. And therefore, we don't need that preparation and transition from Tara to Tumah. Okay, I'm just mentioning the Maharal Miprad. It's so typical of the Maharal. In any event, the Gemara says the following: Amalei Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan Ema. Why not suggest that the word Ish in this pasuk in Balotcha is teaching us that Ish nidcha lePesach Sheni, Tzibur lesle takanto lo bePesach Rishon lo bePesach Sheni. If the word Ish is coming to tell you that we're dealing with an individual as opposed to Rov Tzibur, this individual is Tameh. So the Torah is telling me that a Yachid has the option of Pesach Sheni. And the exclusion, which according to Rabbi Yochanan is that a Tzibur doesn't need Pesach Sheni, they can bring the Korban Pesach Rishon. No, says Reish Lakish, the exclusion is going to be that with regard to Pesach Sheni, with regard to a Tzibur, there is no entity, there is no salvation and Pesach Sheni. That's what the word Ish is excluding. And perhaps what Reish Lakish means is that if Rova Tzibur Tmeim, and therefore we consider as if the Tzibur is Tamei, so the Torah says in that case there is no obligation that filters down through the pipelines of the Tzibur as far as Korban Pesach is. So therefore, Reish Lakish has to find an alternative source from whence to derive that Pesach overrides Tumah in the case of Rovat Tzibur. Let's derive it from Moshe Rabbeinu at the time the Bnei Yisrael were in the Midbar, and the pasuk tells us Zav es b'nei Yisrael v'yishalchu ben hamachna kol tzarua v'chol zav v'chol tomei l'nefesh. We have here 3 categories of tmeim, and they have to be sent away outside from the machna. Each one has to be sent at a different distance from the machna, as we'll see. So first on the list we have tzarua, and a tzarua is a person who has tzaras, and the Torah dedicates an entire chapter in Vayikra Yud Gimel to his tumah. Then we have a zav. A zav is someone who suffers from a certain disease of ziva, and that's also a perek in Vayikra, perek Tezvav. And finally, we have a tomei l'nefesh, and the Gemara says later on that each one of these groups requires a different shiluach. So now Reish Lakish asks the following question. Yomar Tmei Mesim. The Torah is very stingy on ink. It should have just told me the case of Tmei Mesim. The Al Yomar Zavim Mitzorah. And as far as Shiluach Min HaMachna is concerned, there was no need for the Torah to have to spell out that Zavin and Mitzorayim are sent out of the Machna, Vani Omer, and I would apply the following Kal V'chomer. Im Tmei Mesim Mishtalchim is Zavin and Mitzorayim Lo Kolshken. Now the Gemara is apparently oblivious. Reish Lakish right now is oblivious to the fact that Tomei Mes is a very complicated tumah to get out of. You know, it's worse than the quarantine of a mitzorah, in the sense that a mitzorah, when he finishes his hezger, he goes into the mikvah, he brings his karbanos, and he's tar. Not so in the case of Tomei Mes. He needs hazah b'shlishi b'shvi from the mechatas. But the Gemara is right now oblivious to that. The Gemara is now focused on different categories of tumah. One category is internal, and the other is external. Internal means it's yotze migufo. So something that comes out of his body, a secretion, generates tumah. So that's like an internal tumah. And that applies in the case of what? Of zav and mitzorah. It's all in the guf, as opposed to the external tumah of having a contact with a corpse of Tomei Mes. And therefore, the Gemara, Reish Lakish thinks that the Torah did not have to spell out Zavim u'Mitzorayim as far as Shiluach Min HaMachna. We would certainly derive this in a Kal V'chomer from Tomei Mes. And now we have a kasha here, the Sfas Emes. V'ein Lomar, he says, She'ilu ha'nilmad Shiluach hazavim ha'mitzorayim b'Kal V'chomer lo yulokin al kach sharei ein od shemin adin. Maybe the reason why the Torah spelled out a zav and a mitzorah is in order to generate malchus, because if you derive from Kal V'chomer, we have a principle ein od shemin adin. Says im hayanilma b'Kal V'chomer mashe never b'posuk v'lo yitamus machaneim hayamur af klapeim sharehem kimufuroshin b'posuk. He says that in this case we would not apply the principle of ein od shemin adin. Why? Because there are 2 psukim that are contiguous. The first pasuk formulates the obligation of shiluach min hamachna. That's a kumbaseh. The second says lo yitamus machaneim. That's a lo saseh. Once we know who's included in v'yishalchu min hamachna, then Memela, he's included in the lav that follows immediately of lo yitamus machaneim. How do we know that zav and mitzorah are included in the essay of shiluach min hamachna? That's based on the Kal V'chomer. But once we have the Kal V'chomer, now, in light of the Kal V'chomer, we interpret the very next pasuk of lo yitamus machaneim to include not just a Tomei Mes, but a zav and a mitzorah as well. Now, this whole sugya of Reish Lakish is very, very difficult, because, as I said before, the Gemara is going to derive from these psukim that each one of these three categories has a different shiluach min hamachna. So, for example, a mitzora has shiluach shalosh machnos, and a zav is a shiluach from 2 machnos, which includes even the machna of Levia. Whereas in the case of a zav, he has shiluach even from machna shechina. So we have different levels of shiluach here, and the whole premise of this question of Reish Lakish, that why did the Torah have to spell out zav and mitzora, is a very strange premise. So that's what Tosfos says. If you look at the last Tosfos, Tamel Rashba, the Lidrosh Reish, what does it say there? Lider Reish Lakish. He says, Tamel Rashba, Lider Reish Lakish, Inichal Rab Yehuda, Rab Shimon, the Omer Kaman, the Lahachi Kosav Rachmana Tomei Mes, Zav, Umitzol Fisha Chalukim B'Shiluch Machnos, is Pesach B'Dochi Tumah Minole. In other words, the entire source of Reish Lakish for Pesach being Doche Tumah is going to be this extra phrase in the pasuk that Torah spells out Zav and Mitzora. That doesn't work out according to Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon needs those psukim of Zav and Mitzora for the special dinim of Shiluach min hamach. But Tosfos implies that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Yehuda did not have this drasha of the Shiluach of Gimel Machnos. Okay, now we can start with Samach Zayin. That's really the daf that I wanted to. He says, Ella, why did the Torah spell out Zav and Mitzora? Yesh lecha shash as Zav and Mitzora mishtalchin v'ein tmei mesim mishtalchin. That there will be an occasion on which we will send the Zav and the Mitzora out of the Azara, whereas the Tmei Mesim will remain in the Azara. Like, take the following example. Imagine if you were to show up on Erev Pesach in the afternoon in the Azara, and you find multitudes of Jews inside the Azara. Wouldn't you assume they're all Tahorim and none of them are Tmeim that bring a Korban Pesach? The answer is no, they might be Tmeim. Why are they in the Azara to bring the Korban Pesach? Because Halacha is that we don't send the Tmeim outside of the Azara for the sake of the Korban Pesach in a case of Rov Tzibur Tmeim, because the Torah says that Korban Pesach is Docha Tumah. But you will never see a Zav and a Mitzora in the Azara bringing a Korban. They always have to be sent min hamachna. So the Torah had to spell out the shiluach min hamachna of not only a Tomei Mes, but also a Mitzora and a Zav, in order to tell you that there are certain situations in which shiluach min hamachna will apply to the Zav and the Mitzora, but it would not apply to the Korban Pesach. I'm sorry, it would not apply to a Tomei Mes, and that's going to be on Erev Pesach in the 14th of Nisan, and that's based on the fact that Zeh Pesach Haba B'Tum. When Rova Tzibur Tmeim, then we were allowed the Tmeim to come into the Azara, and a person was Tomei Mes, we invite him into the Azara, to Pella, to be makar of his Korban, and we're not going to send him out of the Mach, because for the sake of the Korban Pesach, we're going to override Tumas Mes. Omar Abai is not happy with Reish Lakish. If the pasuk is coming to teach me the way Reish Lakish is saying Lema Nami, we should say Yomar. The pasuk should say that we should send out the Zav and the Tmei Mesim Val Yomar Mitzora. Reish Lakish, you have not yet justified the extra word Mitzora. I understand Zav because you're telling me that a Zav does not have the ability to remain in the Azara, and it's only a Tomei Mes. But why did you have to mention Mitzora? Ani Omer, I would say Zav Mishtaleach, Mitzora Lo Kolshke. Tell me that a Zav, which is a lower level of Tumah than Mitzora, he has to be sent out of the Azara. then how much more so in a case of a mitzorah, because a mitzorah has a more severe tumah. And the Gemara hasn't yet spelled out why and how you derive this conclusion that mitzorah is more tameh than a zav. Ella, but rather, says Abaye, this pasuk is coming to tell you, Yesh lecha shosh ha-mitzorahim mishtalchim, the ein zaven utmei mesim mishtalchim, which means that zav, insofar as it's a lower level of tumah than mitzorah, will be grouped and lumped together with the tmei mesim. And in the case of rovat tzibbur tmeim, when we bring the Korban Pesach b'tumah, not only will we invite the Tmei Mesim into the Azor, we'll invite the Zavim as well, to the exclusion of the Mitzorayim. And why? Because the Mitzorayim have a Tumah Chamura when we compare it to Zav and Mes, and Tomei Mes. Now, according to Abayi's analysis of Reish Lakish's drasha, the extra mitzorah pasuk is telling me something of good news, so to speak, about the zav. That not only in the case of rov tzibur tmeim will we override tumah and allow a tamei mes to come into the azar to do the korban, but will allow even the zav. Abai says that's the conclusion we derive from the drasha of Reish Lakish. It can't be V'asnan. We have a Mishnah later on in Masechet Pesachim on Pesach ba b'tumah. Lo yochlu mimenu zavim v'zavos nidos v'yoldos v'im achlu p'turim. According to the drasha of Reish Lakish, a zav will be included in what's called asiyas Pesach b'tumah. And here the Mishnah says, no, the Zav is not allowed to partake in the Korban Pesach, even in a case of Pesach haba b'tumah. That undermines the whole drasha of Reish Lakish. Now, why is the Zav patur if he eats from the Korban Pesach? I have here a note. He says, Al afsha ochem and akodshim b'tumas haguf chayv kares. A tamei who eats kodshim is chayiv kares, and now the zav is not allowed to eat kodshim, even in the case of Pesach haba b'tumah, when rov tzibur atmeim, he should be now chayiv under the law of kol meisha achal kodshim, which is the chayiv kares. Why does it say patur? But for this, we have to know a sugya much later on, which is very complicated. At Pesach haba b'tumah, there's a special pasuk that tells us that if the Zav eats from the Pesach haba b'tumah, he doesn't get malchus, he doesn't get punished. Now, here we have a kash again from the Tzlach. Today is the Tzlach's day. He says, kasha. Madua hayu tzrichim lahavi sofa mishnah. Shim achlu pturim. Why did the Gemara just cut out the Mishnah? Usually when the Gemara quotes a Mishnah as a proof text, it only quotes that part of the Mishnah that's relevant. We didn't have to know that if a Zav goes ahead and he eats from the Korban Pesach, that he's patur. Hare araya hi mitchilas ha-Mishnah, she'ein hazav ose es ha-Pesach af al pi sha'rov tzibur tmeim. Efshal etaretz es divrei Reish Lakish, ha-Torah kosva Zav af al pi she'efshal lomdo mitumas mes, k'dei lamdenu she'tumas Zav Eina nidches mipnei ha-Pesach al af shetumas mes kein nidches. Umashikos v'gabi mitzora, gam mitzora, umishum shechomer mizav, shapesach ba b'tumah, shezav sha'over v'nichnas v'migdash patur, v'ilu mitzora chayev. Ulefichach hevia gemara sa-sefer shal ha-Mishnah, shekein mevuar sham shezavim she'achlu mea-Pesach, Whoa. This is a real doozy of a tzlach. He's medayik that from the fact that it says that if the Zav eats from the Pesach with Tumah, he is patur. The implication is he be chayav for entering into the Azara, meaning there are two possible scenarios here. One possible scenario is that we bring the Korban Pesach out of the Azara and we put it on the table in front of a Zav, and the Zav goes there and eats the Korban Pesach. But there's a much more severe scenario if the Zav himself enters into the Azara. And since this Brisa mentioned, or I should say a Mishnah, mentions that a Zav is potter for eating from the Korban Pesach, i.e. when they brought him the Korban Pesach out from the Azara to his house, the implication is that if he would go into the Azara, he's chayav. Oh, if that be the case, then says the tzlach, we cannot offer an explanation and an answer to Abai's kasha on Reish Lakish. We could have answered that the reason why the Torah spells out Zav and Mitzorah is to teach you that let me go over the mathematics one more time, that the Torah writes Zav to teach you that we cannot derive from Tomei Mes that we are doche tumas ziva for the purpose of the Pesach. And now the Torah adds Mitzorah, which is more chomer than Zav. And Zav, when he goes into the Mikdash, he's potter, and the Mitzorah will be chai. Fascinating logic here of the tzlach, that the Mitzorah would be chayav for going into the Mikdash, and the Zav would not be. And that's why the Torah had to add Mitzorah, because he has his own unique din. That's why we quote the Sefer of the Mishnah to tell us that a Zav is chayav for going into the Mikdash. You can't tell me that the reason why the Torah had to write Mitzorah is to tell you that the Mitzorah is chayav for Bias Mikdash, whereas the Zav is only enjoined from eating the Pesach. But if he goes into the Mikdash, he'll be potter, because Zav is always one step more chomerdik than, Mitzorah is always one step more chomer than Zav. But the answer is no. A Zav, if he goes into the Mikdash, in order to eat the Korban Pesach or to participate in the Akrava, is chayav kares. In any event, Abai doesn't have a justification for both Zav and Mitzorah in the light of Reish Lakish. Elamar Abaye wants to go back to Rabbi Yochanan and now defend Rabbi Yochanan against the objection of Reish Lakish. The Olam, what's the source that Pesach is bar b'tumah? Mikra Kama, from the original pasuk of Reish Lakish of Rabbi Yochanan, that the word ish indicates that only the Yachid is pushed off till Pesach Sheni, but the Tzibbur can bring Pesach Rishon on the 14th of Nisan. Reish Lakish says no. Why don't we say that the word ish is telling me that the ish, the Yachid, gets Pesach Sheni, and the Tzibbur doesn't get neither Pesach Rishon nor Pesach Sheni? Im Kain, according to your logic, Reish Lakish, Nichtav Rachmana, the Torah should have said ish ki yeh tameh. Period. Now, the pasuk says, let's go back to Samach Vav Amid Beis. The pasuk says, ish ki yeh tameh lin nefesh. Lin nefesh, the extra word lin nefesh, which means that he's a tameh mes. He came in contact with a corpse. And la nefesh lamali. Now, we would say that la nefesh is coming to exclude other tumas, that we have a chumrah in other tumas that we don't have in tumas mes. So this pasuk is somehow introducing a kula with regard to tumas mes that wouldn't apply to other forms of tumah. Now, if you're going to tell me, Reish Lakish, that even in the case of rov tzibur tmeim, we're going to say that they're not going to be makriv of the Pesach at all. So if most of the tzibur came in contact with the dead, let's say it was a milchama, I don't know what, then there is no Korban Pesach. If that be the case, then what's the distinction here between Tumas Mes and other forms of Tumah? Because if there's Rov and they cannot bring the Korban Pesach, that's it. Korban Pesach is a goner. There is no Korban Pesach, according to you, Reish Lakish. And if you'll say, Hi, lo nefesh lahach yudi asa hatame hatmei mes. You should read it. Besmichus, right? Hatmei mes who did nidche Pesach sheni aval shar tmeim lo. In other words, he's saying a brilliant reformulation of Reish Lakish's objection. Reish Lakish is going to ask the following kasha to Rabbi Yochanan, that maybe the Exur Lenefesh is differentiating between Tamei Mes and the other forms of Tumah, but not to say that in a case of Tamei Mes, they bring the Korban bit Tumah, but rather they pushed off to Pesach Sheni, as opposed to the other forms of Tumah like Zav and Mitzorah. They don't have the option of Pesach Sheni. They're completely excluded from the Korban Pesach. So the Gemara rejects that. For Asanya, we learned in the Brisa, Yachalo you osim Pesach Sheni, Elit Mei Mesim, and V'Hayu B'derech Rechoka. I might think that the Torah only gives license for Pesach Sheni in these two categories of Mei Mesim and Hayu B'derech Rechoka, because both of these are mentioned explicitly in the pasuk that they are pushed off to Pesach Sheni. But not in the case of Zav and Mitzorah and Bolei Nidos. In those cases, I would think if I don't have a pasuk, they don't have the option of Pesach Sheni Minayin. How do we know that they have the option of Pesach Sheni? Talmud Lomar Ish Kiyeh Tameh, which means that all Tmeim are those who are Tameh on Yudalid will do Pesach Sheni. So then you can ask me Lenefesh the Kosev Rachmana Lomali. The Bryce itself now raises the question that we've been grappling with. Why add the word Lenefesh if you're lumping together and equating all forms of Tumah? Elahachi Kamar Ish. If he's a Yachid and he's Tameh, Nidcha Pesach Sheni. What kind of Tumah? Tumas Mes. The Ein Tzibur Nidche LePesach Sheni Ela Avdei B'Tumah. If the Tzibur, Rov the Tzibur, it means, have contracted Tumas Mes, then they don't get pushed off till the 14th of the year. They'll bring the Korban Bismano on the 14th of Nisan. And now we understand very well what the word Lenefesh means. Ki Avdi, when do we say that the Tzibur will bring a Korban Pesach on the 14th B'Tumah, when Rov the Tzibur Tmeim? That's only B'Tumas Mes. Aval Bishar Tumas Lo Avdi. So just give me a minute here. I saw a footnote. Here. You have the English translation. It's on Zion.
Yeah, I have it here.
You tell me what number it is. It'll take me a while till I open it up because it's not open to the right page.
What? Some of Zion? Well, 60...
No, I need to say the note that we need here. Just 1 second.
Oh, okay. Tell me which note you're looking
Lo
for.
Avdi. It should be here. 1 second. Oh, he says, when contaminated with other forms of Tumah, it does not make, okay, so the English here is a little bit strange, but does not make the Pesach offering.
Which note are you looking at?
Well, I'm not up to note 12 yet. I'm just reading the text, and then we'll take a look at note
Oh,
number
okay,
12.
sorry. Okay, okay, note
So we're on
12.
the top, above the line, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
He says the
No.
words "any man who will be tamei" teach that a tamei congregation is permitted to bring the first Pesach, and then it says lenefesh limits this permit to those who are afflicted with corpse tumah, that's tumas mes. So we see from this pasuk that the Pesach overrides the laws of tumah, and therefore when we have the word b'moado, and that is going to teach us that tamid, which also has the word b'moado in the Gzeir Shava, likewise overrides tumah. So when he says shar tumas lo avdi, he means that even if rov tzibur atmeim, and therefore we will bring the first korban, meaning the Pesach bismano, nevertheless lenefesh is coming to teach me that we only allow those who are tamei from tumas mes to participate in the Korban Pesach. So I thought I saw a note, maybe it was note 10. Oh, let's see. Abayi's argument hinges on the fact that the pasuk unquestionably means the phrase lenefesh to teach a chumrah with regard to tumas tsaras and tumas ziva, and it's excluding them from the law of someone who was tamei mes. What is that exclusion? He says that exclusion is possible only if the words ish imply that a tamei, meaning when rov hatzibur atmeim, they could bring the first Pesach. And he writes here a whole shtickle Torah here in the note. You have this note number 10. Or considering that the exclusion, the miyut cannot concern the pasuk's explicit subject, an individual's right to bring the second pasuk, since the Brisa states clearly that Mitzoraim and Zavin may participate in Pesach Sheni. Right? That's what we learned from the Brisa. Let's go over the Brisa one more time. Right? The Brisa said, Yachal lo yu osim Pesach Sheni ela tmei mesim, or Mishal Yibedech Choka, but Zavin and Mitzoraim Bolenidos, Minayin, how do we know this? Each, and Lenefesh. So we have ish to tell me that even someone who's tamei tumas zav and tumas mitzora will have the option of Pesach Sheni. He's not excluded from Pesach Sheni. So why did Torah add lenefesh? There must be some chumrah in zav and in mitzora that doesn't apply in Pesach Sheni, or I'm sorry, in tamei mes, or say it the other way around. There's a kula in tamei mes. But what is this kula of tamei mes? He says you cannot say that the kula of tamei mes is that tamei mes has the option of Pesach Sheni, whereas the other tumas that are more chamor do not have the option of Pesach Sheni, because we already had the brisa, and the brisa derived from ish that all three categories of tumah have the option of Pesach Sheni. Therefore, we have no choice, but it must concern the pasuk's implied subject, a different subject, not the subject of Pesach Sheni, but dafka of Pesach Rishon. That if rov hatzibur tmeim, there's an option of Pesach Rishon because it's a Pesach haba b'tumah, but that's going to be limited, that option, only to tamei mes, and that's why the Torah adds lenefesh. That's going to teach us that with regard to a mitzora or a zav, we have to be more machmir. They don't have the right to participate in what's called a Pesach haba b'tumah. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show you here. Now, let's keep a scorecard here. We still don't know why Tumah goes from the less severe of Tumas Mes to the more severe of Zav to the most severe of Mitzorah. I mean, that the Gemara hasn't explicated yet. Hopefully that's going to come around the bend. But now we're going to learn a sugya about Shiluach Machnos. Right? The Torah says that a Tomei has to be sent out of the Migdash.
Can I just ask for a person in the hierarchy of Tumah? The hierarchy of Tumah's Mitzorah is typically more than Tumah's Mace.
Even though a Mitzorah doesn't need Hazah from the Mechad.
Right.
But the laws of Tumah's Mitzorah are more chomer, and the Gemara is going to try to analyze them. You know, we haven't had really heavy Tara since Reb Chanina Scott Partner back at the beginning. But this sugya that we're about to learn, I don't know if we'll get a chance today, is just one notch easier than Reb Chanina Scott Cohen. It's a close second, as we'd say. Okay. Now, I just want to mention that the Torah says in Bamidbar Perkei, Tzavas b'nei Yisrael v'yishlechu min hamachta kol tzarua v'chol zav v'chol tomi l'nefesh. And they have to be sent out of the Migdash. And we're going to see that there are other places that are also included in the machne, the word machne, that goes beyond the Beis HaMikdash. So when it says in the pasuk, v'yishlechu min hamachne, it doesn't just mean the Beis HaMikdash. The word machne is an all-inclusive term that refers to places that are sanctified. However, here's the difference. The lower levels of Tumah are what we call external Tumahs, meaning Tumahs Mes or Tumah Sheretz. And here the Torah says, get them out of what's called the Machne Shechina. But as far as going into the Machne Leviyah, that they would be allowed to. Now, there's a shar called Shar Nikanor. Once you cross over Shar Nikanor and you enter into the Azara, that's called the Machne Shechina. As far as a Zav is concerned, and we'll soon see that a Balkari also has the same Chumrah, he's not allowed to go into the Machne Leviyah. That means he's excluded from the entire Harabayis. The Mitzorah is the most severe level of Tumah. Again, we have to figure out why, but it expresses itself in that he has to be sent Chutz L'Machne Yisrael, which means he's not allowed to go L'fnim and Achoma, not of Yerushalayim and not of any city in Israel. Every city in Israel that has a Choma, it's a fascinating idea when you think of it philosophically, but a Choma is really for security purposes, to protect us against our adversaries. Like Yericho, for example, was surrounded by a wall. But the Torah sees that as a Makadish. The fact that it gives us a sense of security, that sanctifies it. Unfortunately, and I say it with a kreftz in my heart, you know, the synagogues here in my neighborhood are not secure. And they lack a little bit of an element of that Kedusha. I'm saying it on a philosophical level. I don't mean halachically, but
Sorry, so what do you mean they're not secure? You mean they're not...
I mean, you know, I was davening 6 years ago in my shul, 5 minutes away in the next shul over, my chavrusa was being murdered by terrorists, together with another 5 people. There was no security. And, you know, this makes an impact on the heart, because every time you go out of your house and you go to shul and you look around, where's the security? You know what I mean? Okay, now the Gemara is going to talk about a machlokes as far as Mitzorah is concerned. What happens if Mitzorah violates this Isur of Lo Yitamus Machaneim, and he enters into inside the chomos of any of the cities of Israel? Mitzorah shenichnas lifnim mimechitzaso, he enters into the choma of any of the cities of Israel, potter mimalchus. And why is he potter mimalchus? After all, he violates the lav lo yitamus machaneim. Now, theoretically, this statement of Rav Chizda should not be limited to a mitzora. It should apply to a tamei mes in the case where he enters into the machne shechina, or a zav who enters into the machne levia. So we have to figure out why Rav Chizda is totally focused on the mitzora. But even though it says lo yitamus machaneim, the answer is shenemar bodad yeshev chutz lamachne moshovo harei hakosiv nitko li ese. So we have something called a lava nitak li ese, right? The classic case of lava nitak li ese is shiluach hakan. And the Torah says that if you took the mother bird while she was hovering over the fledglings, you have to send out the mother bird. That's called a tikkun on the essay, on the lav, excuse me. And here also the Torah says lo yitamus machaneim, but badav yeshev chutzamach, and that means the Torah gave you the option of fixing up the lav, so to speak. Okay. Now, in the cases of tamei mes and zav, we don't have such an essay of badad yeshev chutz lamachne, and therefore there will be malchus if he enters into the machne shechina, or in the case of a zav, machne levia. Esvei, the Gemara asks the following kasha: mitzora shenichnas lifnimi mechutzaso. The arboim, he gets malchus. And now we have a stira between Rav Chizda and a Brisa. Rav Chizda says that a mitzora enters into chutz l'mechitzos, he goes within the mechitzos, he doesn't get malchus because a lava nitak lesson. Here we have a Brisa that says explicitly he gets malchus. The Brisa continues: Zavin v'zavos shenichnasu lifnimi mechitzosam. They entered into the Arabayis, which is called the machne levia, is nidodim arboim. Tamei mes mutal ikonis lemach levia v'lo tamei mes bilvad omru elafila mes atzmo shenever v'yikach Moshes atzmos Yosef imo b'mechitzasa. So as far as machne levia is concerned, there's no problem with tumas mes. Even the mes himself could be brought in to the machne levia, onto the Harabayis. Now, there's a strange interpretation here of Rashi. Rashi says that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Levi, and therefore wherever he took the atzamos of Yosef, that was considered al pidin, a walking machne levia. In any event, if Moshe Rabbeinu took the atzmos Yosef, and that's the mes atzmo, then how much more so would a tamei mes be allowed to enter into machne levia, which is the Harabayis. In any event, the reisha of this brisa is explicitly against Rav Chizda, because a mitzora who enters into machne Yisrael gets malchus. And Gemara says Tanoihi. This is actually the subject of machlokas Tanoim B'Sanya with regard to mitzora. It says Badad Yeshev Mechutz L'Machne Shavo Levado Yeshev. It says Badad Yeshev. And what does that mean? Levado Yeshev. What is this coming to teach me? Shaloyu Tmeim Acherim Yoshim Imo. That when he is sent out of the machne, other Tmeim, like for example Zavim or Tmei Mace, should not be with him. He's got to be totally quarantined. And that gives that status of Chumrah to a mitzora. Remember, we were asking before, what makes mitzora on the hierarchy of Tumah on the top of the pole, top of the pinnacle? And the answer is not only is he sent chutz lamachne, which in itself is a unique chumrah of mitzora, but not only that, Badad Yeshev, he can't even be there with other Tmeim. You would think if other Tmeim are with him, so what's the terrible thing? They've you already have corona, so you can't get it twice, right? At least not simultaneously, I mean.
Right.
Yochel, I might think, you Zavim Tmei Mesim Mishtalchin Lemachna Achas. I might think that we should square off Zavim and Tmei Mesim, and they should have the same status as the Mitzora. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, "Lo yitamu es machaneim b'loshen rabim." It should have said machanom. Machanom would refer to each one of them. Machaneim tells me that each one has a separate machne from which he's excluded. He's ejected. Litein machne lezeh umachne lezeh. Each one of these three tmeim has a different din of shiluach machne. And that's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Eino tzorach. I don't need the drush of Badad Yeshev to teach me that the mitzorah has to be sent chutz l'sholosh machnos. Hareu Omer, the pasuk says, v'yishalchu min ha-machne kol tzarua v'chol zav v'chol tomi l'nefesh. And we would have thought that this pasuk itself is going to teach me those distinctions, the chilukim of shilucham and shalatmeim. And how so? Because Yomar Tmei Meis V'al Yomar Tmei Zov, and Omer, I would imply the Kavachomer, Tmei Meis and Ishtalchin Zovim Lo Kolchkin. Is Lama Nemar Zov, Litein Lo Machne Shnia. Yomar Zov, V'al Yomar Mitzorah, and Omer Zovim Ishtalchin, they have to be sent out of two machnos, is Mitzorah and Lo Kolchkin. Because the Mitzorah has a Tumah Chamura. Lama nemar mitzorah litin lo machne shliches. So it's a hierarchy. You know, we go min akal lachomer, and each time we add another machne. Kishu omer badad yeshev. Now we don't need the pasuk badad yeshev to teach me, as Rabbi Yehuda had derived from this pasuk, that we have to separate them into three dinim and three different machnos with the hierarchy. Oh, no. Badad Yeshev is Bar Kosuv Lenatko Le'esei. So this is the Shita of Rav Chizda, like Rabbi Shimon in this brisa, namely that the pasuk Badad Yeshev is coming to teach me that there's a nituk essay on the lav and there's no malchus. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda, he uses the pasuk Badad Yeshev for something else, to set up these hierarchies of different machnos. And that's why the other brisa that we saw earlier establishes that the Mitzorah will get malchus if he crosses the borderline and enters into the cities that are walled cities inside those cities. Because we don't have the pasuk Badad Yeshev to be menatek the lav of lo yitamu es machaneim, and therefore becomes like a regular lav. And now we get to the kishkis. This is what I wanted to end our discussion today with this Gemara. My chumah dezav mi tomei mes. Now we set up the hierarchy. She came. Tumah yotza lo mi gufo. The case of a zav is an internal tumah. So the Gemara asks, but Adarabah Tomei mes chomer shekein tona zo shlishi v'shvi. We don't need mechatos to be mitayr zav. The zav only needs tvila. So the Gemara answers, you know what? Rabbi Shimon was not telling us that you could derive from shiluach hazav, you could derive shiluach hazav from tomei mes, because after all, tomei mes has a chumrah that zav does not have. Or rather, what he meant to say was Omar Kra. The pasuk says, with regard to those who are chayv in shiluach, it says tomei l'nefesh, and then it says v'chol tomei. Okay, so let's go back to the pasuk. Pasuk says, Ish ki yeh tomei l'nefesh. Second. I thought the Gemara quotes the whole pasuk, but
Yeah, where was the pasuk again? It was.
Yeah, I was hoping we would see it inside. But Midbar Hey, pasuk Gimel. So it says that it says Tamei lenefesh, that we saw. Ishish kiel Tamei lenefesh. And then it says V'chol Tamei. I have a chumash here. Give me a second to open up the chumash because I know it's here, but right now I'm not finding it. Where is it? Hey Bays. I think it's Hey. Not sure if it's Hey Bays. That doesn't sound right to me, but oh, let's see. Find it. No, I'm not finding it right now. You should have it in front of you in one of the notes there. Does he?
Okay, one sec. Where is it? Nagamara. It's definitely Bamidbar, right? It's definitely in
Oh,
Parakeh.
here it is. Here it is. I think I found it. Sav at the beginning of Parak Hey. I was looking in the wrong parsha. Okay. Sav es b'nei Yisrael v'yishalchu b'ramachta called tzarua v'chol zav v'chol tamei lenefesh. So it says v'chol tamei lenefesh. If it would have just said tamei lenefesh, I would have derived tumas metz. But now that it adds v'chol tamei, is l'rabos tamei sheretz. Okay, so this pasuk is teaching me shiluach mimachne shchina, and it applies to two categories: tamei mes and tamei sheretz. V'zav chomer mitarei sheretz. Right, we had a chumrah in tamei mes that he requires hazav, but that chumrah doesn't apply to zav. I'm sorry, to tamei sheretz. So now zav is chomer mitamei sheretz. So that means we could have derived shiluach of a zav with a kavachomer from tamei sheretz. My chumri, what's the chumr of zav as opposed to tamei sheretz? Kidam moron, that it's tumah yotzes migufo. It's an internal tumah. So the Gemara wants to say now that if it would have left out zav, then we would have derived zav from a kal v'chomer. Because the pasuk says v'yichalchum v'namachta kol tzarua v'chol zav, and then it says v'chol tamei lenefesh, and v'chol tamei lenefesh includes not only tamei nefesh, but even a sheretz. And a zav is more common than sheretz because the tumah yotzes migufa. The Gemara says adarab, sheretz chamur shekain metame bionis. So that if a person is ill, and that we can, again, you have to know how to determine this, but his ziva is not a re'iyah ziva, but it's rather what's called machmas ones, meaning he has some illness, then in such a case he's not tamei tumah ziva. and that's a kula in zav. We have no such thing in parallel in sheretz. A sheretz falls on top of someone's head, and the person contracts tumah. So therefore, how can you tell me that the pasuk should have just written v'chol tamei to include tumas sheretz, and I would automatically derive zav with the kal v'chomer? No. Zav has a kula, and there's no parallel in sheretz. Amri. So the Gemara answers on Daf Samach Zayin Amid Beis, Ki hai gavna zav nami temuye mitame biones. Okay, so we need Rav Huna's help over here, because how could it be that a zav is mitame biones? We know the zav is not mitame biones. Kid Rav Huna, Diam Rav Huna, re'ir rishonet shel zav mitama biones. Not sure if he's talking about a Balkari now. Let's just think. Re'ir Rishona Shel Zav. So this is a hekesh to a Balkari. Because the pasuk says, Zos Torah Sazav, Vashatetzi Menu Shichvas Zora. So he had one Re'ir of Ziva. And he's told me a tumas erev like a balkari. And Rav Huna says that this tumah is contracted even the ones. Oh, hey, I needed this line badly. Ha'evdel bein zav lekeri hu shezov nire kilovan beitza sheina ruya sheyetzim imenu efra. The keri nire kilovan beitza. Unbelievable. You would really have to have an absolute expert to know the difference between ziva and keri.
Right.
There are two types of eggs. There's a beitza sheina ruya sheyetzim imenu efra. That's an unfertilized egg, and then there's a beitza sheruya lekach, meaning it could have a chick inside. And each of these two eggs have a different loven, a different like white kind of color. And that's the difference between a zav and a keri. In any event, the first riyah of a zav, according to Rav Huna, even if it was ba'ones, generates a tumas erev. So therefore, there's no chumrah in sheretz above and beyond the zav. Now, Zav has a chumrah that Sheretz doesn't have, because Zav is Tumah Yotzes Migufo. Therefore, we could have derived Shiluach HaZav with a Kal V'chomer from Sheretz. Umay chumrah de Mitzorah Mizav. Why did the Bryce insist that we could derive Zav? I'm sorry, we could derive Mitzorah from Zav with the Kal V'chomer. Shekain Tov Priya Uprima. The Asa B'Shtash Shamita. Adarab Zav Chomer Shekem Mitami Mishkav Moshav Umitami Klicheres Behesed Omakra Zav V'Chol Zav L'Rabos Balkeri, and Mitzorah is Chomer Mi Balkeri. Okay, we'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, very interesting.
And we were able to hop around a little bit. Again,
Yeah,
it's a lot of
good.
heavy taras. So you have to know so much about
Yeah,
taras, but
taras.
we'll try our best.
Yeah, that was good.
All right, cool too. Have a great
Okay.
day
Yeah,
and a
too.
great
Have a good
week.
one.